billionaire CEO's office was a fortress of glass and steel, gleaming under the cold glow of city lights. His world was sharp, precise, and ruthless. Every decision he made shaped millions, and his reputation was built on a foundation of iron will and cutthroat strategy. Yet in this towering palace of power, one presence went completely unnoticed, a young janitor who moved silently through the shadows each night, her work unacknowledged by all but the cleaning machines humming softly in the background. She was a quiet figure, dressed in a simple uniform, her eyes focused and steady as she pushed the mop across the gleaming floor. The CEO had never given her a second thought. To him, she was just another face in the background of his empire, an invisible blur in the margins of his carefully controlled life. She swept, wiped, and vanished before dawn, leaving no trace except spotless halls and empty trash bins. But what he did not know was that beneath her unassuming exterior lay a secret that would shatter his assumptions. One late evening, when the office was hushed and most had left, the CEO lingered, reviewing contracts under the dim light of his desk lamp. That was when he heard it, a voice soft but commanding, weaving through the silence. Curious, he leaned closer and caught words slipping through the air in a language he could not place. Then another, and another, shifting with perfect fluency from one tongue to the next. Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, Russian. 8 languages, spoken flawlessly into a phone. The voice belonged to the janitor. He sat frozen, his mind racing. How had he never heard this before? Who was this girl with a voice so confident and so skilled, hidden away in the quiet corners of his office? The walls he had built around his life suddenly felt fragile, and a spark of something new flickered inside him. Not power, but intrigue. The night had changed. The janitor was no longer just a shadow in the background. She was a puzzle he had to solve, and what he decided to do next would ripple through the lives of everyone around him. The first step was clear. He needed to confront her. The next morning, the billionaire CEO stood just outside the janitor's usual cleaning route, waiting for the moment he would finally speak to the woman who had unsettled his carefully ordered world. When she appeared quiet and focused as always, her hands steady with the mop and bucket, he called out sharply, "Wait!" She froze, eyes flickering with surprise but no fear. "Why are you scrubbing floors when you speak 8 languages like a diplomat?" His voice was hard, but beneath it lay a restless curiosity. She looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. "It is not about what I can do," she said softly, "but what life has allowed me to do." There was no anger, only a quiet sadness that settled in the room like a heavy mist. She told him about her parents, immigrants who came here with nothing but dreams and struggle. How her brilliance had never been enough to open doors that required college degrees she could not afford, connections she did not have, or chances others took for granted. "I learned those languages from books and people I met along the way. They became my voice when others would not listen." Her words were simple but carried the weight of countless disappointments and relentless determination. The CEO listened, his mind wrestling with a mix of disbelief and something he had not expected: respect. Here was someone with the intellect and spirit that could have led a very different life. Yet she chose humility over bitterness. The contrast struck him deeply. The office around them buzzed with its usual cold efficiency, but in this moment, something shifted. He saw beyond her uniform, past the mop and bucket, into a story of resilience and silent strength. Yet he remained silent, contemplating the world that had failed her, and wondering how she had remained invisible for so long. The encounter left him unsettled, curious if her story was the first crack in his unyielding empire. And then, without warning, he asked the question no one expected. The office fell into an uneasy hush the moment the billionaire CEO made his announcement. Instead of offering the janitor a job or a promotion, he shocked everyone by demanding something few could have imagined. "You will work for me, but not in any role you expect," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that left the room trembling. The murmurs around them rose like a tide, but she stood still, her face calm but unreadable. His demand was simple yet strange. She was to become his personal linguistic consultant, an advisor for his international dealings, a shadow presence translating, negotiating, and navigating hidden networks of power behind closed doors. You will be the voice no one hears but everyone listens to, he declared. The office staff exchanged glances, some confused, others skeptical. What was the point of such a secret weapon? Was this another game of control, or a genuine recognition of her rare talent? She took a slow breath, weighing the offer that came wrapped in an unusual mix of challenge and risk. I accept, she said quietly, the decision carrying more than just ambition. It held the weight of years spent invisible, waiting for a moment like this. The CEO nodded, but there was something deeper beneath his cold exterior. An unspoken understanding that this was not just business, but the start of something neither of them fully grasped yet. As she walked away to prepare for her new role, the office remained stunned, caught between disbelief and anticipation, sensing that the quiet janitor's world and the CEO's empire were about to change forever. The janitor's days now followed a rhythm far different from before. By night, she still moved through the silent corridors, cleaning with the same quiet care. But by day, she became something else entirely, a silent force at the CEO's side, translating whispered deals, decoding hidden meanings, and weaving her way through the unseen threads of global power. Few noticed this transformation, but one person did. The longtime night janitor, Mr. Harris, who had watched her for months. Mr. Harris was a quiet man, the kind who saw more than he said. He had witnessed her struggle, the exhaustion behind her steady hands, the flickers of brilliance in her eyes as she worked late hours and spoke softly to herself in different languages. One evening, as she passed by with a heavy load of supplies, he stopped her. "You're more than you let on, aren't you?" he whispered. She paused, surprised but unafraid. "I have to be," she replied. His nod was slow, as if understanding the burden she carried. The invisible fight to belong in a world that seemed determined to keep her small. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior, a secret simmered, one she guarded fiercely. It was not just her skill with languages or her hidden intelligence. There was something more powerful, something that connected her past with the fragile future of the CEO's empire. It was a truth she had kept locked away, buried beneath layers of silence and shadows. As she wiped down a glass panel, her reflection fractured by the harsh office lights, she whispered to herself, "Soon they will know why I have stayed hidden." The weight of that secret was heavier than any mop or bucket she carried, and the moment to reveal it was drawing closer, threatening to change everything. Behind the steel walls of his office, the CEO sat alone, the hum of the city faint beneath the pounding of his thoughts. He was a man used to controlling, to knowing every angle, every move in his world of deals and power plays. Yet since meeting the janitor girl, a quiet storm had unsettled him, a doubt he could neither ignore nor explain. How had he overlooked someone so capable for so long? And why did her presence now unsettle the very foundation of his empire? His mind replayed her words, her calm strength, and the unspoken pain she carried. For a man whose life was built on certainty, this was unfamiliar terrain. What if I am wrong about her, he thought, the question bitter and sharp. It was a vulnerability he had long buried beneath layers of ambition. He found himself searching for answers in the silence of the night, questioning the cold rules he lived by. The empire he had crafted was vast, but it had never felt this fragile. Then, as if pulled by fate, his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. The words on the screen were cryptic, hinting at secrets and dangers tied to the janitor's past. His heart quickened. Was this a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? The line between ally and enemy blurred, and the CEO knew one thing with certainty. The choices he made next would not only test his power, but challenge everything he believed about loyalty, strength, and trust. The game was changing, and he was no longer sure who was holding the cards. The janitor's secret was not just a hidden skill or a story of hardship. It was something that could shake the very core of the CEO's empire. One afternoon, in the privacy of the CEO's glass-walled office, she finally revealed the truth. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of years spent guarding this knowledge. "There are forces at work within your company that you do not see," she said quietly. "People who would use your trust against you." The CEO leaned forward, tension tightening his jaw. She spoke of a web of corruption, Alliances formed in shadow, and deals made to benefit only a few while risking everything for the rest. She had uncovered evidence, documents, conversations, patterns that exposed hidden threats to his business and reputation. It was a dangerous revelation, one that could either destroy him or give him the power to strike back. He stared at her, the lines of his face hardening. Fear flickered behind his eyes, but beneath it, something stronger, an urgent fascination. This janitor, once invisible, was now holding the key to his survival. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then we are no longer just dealing with business. We are fighting for everything." The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of this new truth settling like a storm ready to break. What came next would change them both, and the empire forever. The CEO's trust was not given lightly, and the janitor knew that earning it would be a trial by fire. She was handed tasks that demanded not only her linguistic skill, but her judgment and discretion in a world where one wrong move meant disaster. Each assignment was a test, decoding cryptic messages from foreign partners, navigating tense negotiations where a single word could tip the balance, and uncovering hidden alliances threatening to unravel the company from within. Despite the pressure, she met every challenge with calm precision. Her mind moved like a chess player, anticipating moves before they were made, reading between the lines and never revealing the full extent of her knowledge. Yet shadows lurked even in this fragile trust. Some within the company whispered doubts, questioning how a janitor could rise so quickly, while others watched her with wary eyes, unsure if she was a friend or a threat. The tension reached a breaking point when a trusted executive appeared to betray the CEO's confidence. The janitor uncovered evidence of the betrayal, but instead of revealing it immediately, she used the knowledge to test loyalties and gather allies. Her actions shifted the power dynamics in the office, forcing the CEO to rely on her judgment more than ever before. The quiet janitor was no longer just a helper. She was a force shaping the future of the empire. And in the silence of the boardroom, a new game had begun, one where trust was fragile and every move counted. The atmosphere in the office was electric, charged with whispers and glances that carried more meaning than words. The janitor's rise from the shadows had unsettled many, sparking envy in some and quiet admiration in others. Her role as the CEO's trusted advisor was no longer a secret, and with every success, her influence grew. The old power structures began to tremble, shifting beneath the weight of her insight and unwavering calm. Colleagues who once dismissed her now found themselves seeking her opinion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the knowledge she carried. Yet for every ally gained, a rival lurked, fueled by fear and uncertainty. The janitor could feel the eyes of the office on her, not just watching, but weighing her every move. She knew that one misstep could mean falling back into obscurity or worse. But with the CEO's support, she dared to push further, navigating the treacherous waters with a steady hand. Then came the moment that would define this new balance of power. The CEO announced a bold decision, one that challenged long-held traditions and threatened to upend the company's hierarchy. The janitor stood by his side, ready to face the storm that followed. The office held its breath, caught between hope and doubt, as the quiet woman who once cleaned floors prepared to change everything. The game was no longer about survival, it was about transformation, and the world was watching. In a rare quiet moment, the janitor sat alone in the CEO's office, gazing out at the city skyline. The lights flickered like distant dreams, reminding her of a future she had dared to imagine long before this unexpected turn. She had never wanted to simply climb a ladder in the corporate world. Her vision stretched far beyond titles and power. "I want to change how this world works," she had once whispered to herself, "to give voice to those who are unheard." Her dream was one of justice, fairness, and transformation. She had seen how the powerful crushed the vulnerable, how talent and effort were too often ignored because of where someone came from or what they looked like. "This company can be different," she told the CEO during one of their conversations. "Not just a place of profit, but a place of opportunity." Her words surprised him, not just because of their boldness, but because they echoed something buried deep within his own heart. That hope was fragile, though. Just as the two began to imagine a new path forward, an unexpected event shattered the fragile calm. A scandal erupted, a leak, a betrayal from within that threatened to undo all they had built together. The janitor and CEO found themselves standing at a crossroads, forced to confront harsh realities and difficult choices. Their vision hung in the balance, and the coming days would test not only their resolve, but the very future of the empire. The moment of truth arrived quietly, but with thunderous impact. A critical meeting was convened in the company's glass-walled boardroom, where the janitor's sharp mind was called upon to navigate a complex crisis. A major client threatened to pull out, swayed by rumors and half-truths swirling around the company. The CEO looked to her, knowing she held the insight others lacked, an ability to speak not just languages, but the unspoken fears and hopes of those involved. With steady confidence, she stepped forward, translating not just words but intentions. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen both sides of the struggle, the overlooked and the powerful. Slowly, the tension in the room eased as she guided the conversation, bridging divides with empathy and intelligence. It was more than a business negotiation. It was a moment where barriers fell and trust was rebuilt. The CEO's quiet nod was the only acknowledgement she needed, a sign that she had earned her place. The victory was not without its costs. The fragile alliance they had forged was now visible to everyone, drawing both praise and hostility. Some whispered that she was an outsider, a threat to the established order. But the CEO stood firm, publicly recognizing her contributions for the first time. The office buzzed with speculation and shifting loyalties, but in that moment, the janitor had broken through. No longer invisible, but a powerful force reshaping the company's future. Yet even as she stood tall, a storm brewed on the horizon, threatening to undo their hard-won progress. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in as the janitor's true past was finally laid bare. A leak, a curious question from a senior executive, and then the unveiling. Documents and stories that revealed a life far more complicated than anyone had imagined. She was not just a janitor with hidden talents. She was the daughter of a prominent diplomat, someone who had vanished from the public eye under mysterious circumstances. The revelation sent shockwaves through the company. Whispers turned into stunned silence, eyes filled with admiration and disbelief. How had someone with such a background chosen to live in the shadows, scrubbing floors and hiding her true identity? The CEO watched closely as the office grappled with the truth. For him, it was more than a surprise. It was a moment that forced a deep reckoning. The woman who had quietly changed everything was not simply a survivor. She was someone shaped by forces far greater than the boardroom. The tension reached a crescendo when the CEO stood before the company, making a decision that would define his legacy. He could expose her past to gain advantage, or protect her and risk his reputation. "This is not just about business," he said firmly, "but about trust, integrity, and the future we want to build." The room held its breath. The choice was his, and it would echo far beyond the company walls, shaping not only his empire but the lives entwined with it. Just as the company began to settle from the shock of the janitor's revealed past, a new threat emerged, one far more immediate and dangerous. A whistleblower had come forward, accusing the firm of unethical practices tied to a recent deal. The media swarmed, rumors spread like wildfire, and the stock price plummeted. The CEO and the janitor found themselves thrust into the eye of a storm that threatened to destroy everything they had fought to build. Together, they faced the crisis head-on. The janitor's insight into the company's hidden dealings and her skill with languages helped uncover the truth behind the accusations. They uncovered a network of deceit buried deep within the ranks, an enemy who had used the chaos to their advantage. But exposing the corruption meant confronting powerful forces both inside and outside the company. The pressure was immense, and every decision felt like a gamble. In tense meetings and whispered conversations, the CEO and janitor formed a fragile alliance, each relying on the other's strength. Trust was tested and loyalties wavered, but neither backed down. The crisis forced them to confront not only external enemies, but their own fears and doubts. As the company's future hung in the balance, the choices they made now would decide whether they survived or were consumed by the very shadows they sought to escape. The days that followed were a crucible of fire and resolve. The CEO and the janitor worked tirelessly, weaving together a plan to expose the corruption and restore the company's integrity. Each step was measured, calculated, but driven by a shared determination to protect what mattered most. Not just profits, but the people who believed in the vision they had begun to build. The janitor's quiet strength became a beacon in the storm, her calm presence reassuring those who wavered. In the boardroom, tensions flared as the truth surfaced, shaking the foundation of old alliances and forcing former adversaries to reconsider their positions. The CEO showed a side few had seen, a willingness to admit mistakes, to fight not only for power, but for redemption. The janitor's courage inspired others to speak up, revealing hidden truths and joining the effort to cleanse the company. Together, they forged a new path forward, one rooted in trust and accountability. As the crisis passed, the CEO and janitor stood side by side, transformed by the trials they had faced. Their partnership was no longer a secret, but a symbol of hope and change. The empire they rebuilt was stronger, not just because of strategy, but because they had dared to face their shadows and emerge with integrity. The journey had tested them both, but in that struggle, they found not only redemption, but a shared resolve to create a future worth fighting for. With the crisis behind them, the company began to breathe again. The CEO, once known for his ruthless tactics, showed a new side, a leader willing to listen, to change, and to build something lasting. The janitor, no longer hidden in the shadows, stepped into a role that reflected her true talents and dreams. She was appointed head of a new initiative focused on diversity, inclusion, and creating opportunities for those often overlooked. Her vision reached beyond the boardroom walls. She met with employees from all levels, listened to their stories, and worked to tear down the barriers she once faced herself. The company transformed into a place where talent and determination mattered more than background or status. The atmosphere shifted from competition to collaboration, from suspicion to respect. Change was slow but steady, like the rising sun breaking through a long night. One evening, as the city lights shimmered outside the office window, she turned to the CEO and said, "This is just the beginning." His nod was quiet but full of meaning, a shared understanding that their journey was far from over. Together, they had opened a door to a new future, one built on courage, hope, and the promise that no one would ever be invisible again. Years later, the story of the janitor girl and the billionaire CEO had become more than an office legend. It was a testament to transformation and unexpected alliances. The CEO, once feared for his relentless ambition, was remembered as a man who found humility and strength in unlikely places. His empire had shifted from a cold, unyielding machine into a company known for integrity and opportunity. The janitor had become a symbol of perseverance and vision, inspiring countless others who had once been overlooked or dismissed. Her journey, from scrubbing floors in silence to shaping the future of a global empire, reminded everyone that true power lay not in titles or wealth, but in courage and resilience. The final scene unfolded in the company's grand hall, where a plaque was unveiled, honoring the janitor's impact on the company and the lives she had touched. As the CEO stood beside her, he spoke softly. "Our legacy is not what we build alone, but what we lift others to become." The room held its breath, the weight of those words settling deep. In that moment, past and future merged, and the empire's story became one of hope, proof that even the quietest voice can echo across the world. If this story moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage and transformation. Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength surprised you? Share your story in the comments below. We love hearing how ordinary people change the world in extraordinary ways. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter of stories that inspire and empower. Remember, sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones we least expect. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep watching, because every story matters.